My name is Claire Merritt, and for 11 years I believed I had built something real. We lived in a colonial-style house on Birchwood Lane in Naperville, Illinois, the kind of neighborhood where people wave from their driveways and the HOA sends polite emails about lawn edging. I was a high school English teacher. My husband Daniel was a regional sales director for a medical equipment company. We had a golden retriever named Scout, a vegetable garden I tended every spring, and a joint savings account that I was genuinely proud of. We weren't wealthy, but we were stable. We were careful. Or so I thought. The first sign came in February, 14 months before everything fell apart. Daniel started leaving for work earlier than usual, 20 minutes, then 30. I told myself it was a new initiative at his company. Something about expanding the Midwest territory. He'd mentioned it once over dinner, vaguely, while scrolling his phone. I hadn't pushed. Married people develop a certain comfort with not pushing. Then came the phone. He'd always left it on the kitchen counter when he showered. It was a habit, almost architectural. The phone lived by the coffee maker. Then, one morning, I reached for it to check the weather, and it wasn't there. I found it later on the bathroom shelf, screen down. I noticed it. I didn't say anything. In April, we went to my sister Karen's birthday dinner in Evanston. Daniel was distracted all evening, excusing himself twice to take calls outside. On the drive home, I asked who it was. He said it was his regional manager, Barry. I'd met Barry at the company Christmas party 2 years before. Barry wore golf shirts and talked about his grandchildren. I had no real reason to doubt it. But I started watching, not obsessively. I wasn't that woman yet, just noticing. The dry cleaning receipt for a shirt I didn't recognize. A parking garage charge on our shared credit card for an address downtown on a Thursday, when Daniel had told me he was in Peoria for a client meeting. A faint floral smell on his jacket collar that was not my perfume. I told myself there were explanations. I cycled through them the way you do when you love someone and you're afraid of what you'll find if you look too closely. The shirt could belong to a colleague he'd given a ride to. The parking garage could be near a restaurant where he'd had lunch. The perfume could be from a hotel elevator. By June, the credit card statements started arriving slightly later than usual. When I mentioned it to Daniel, he said he'd switched us to paperless billing to reduce clutter. It was reasonable. It was also, I now know, the first deliberate step in a process of financial concealment that had been underway for nearly 6 months. I didn't know any of that in June. I made iced tea and sat on the back porch with Scout and watched the fireflies come out over the garden. The actual rupture came on a Saturday in August. I'd had a difficult week. A parent-teacher conflict that had escalated to the principal, and a recurring pain in my right shoulder I kept ignoring. Daniel had been distant for days, answering in monosyllables, spending evenings on his laptop with the screen angled away. That morning, I made us both coffee and sat across from him at the kitchen table and said quietly that I thought we needed to talk, that something felt wrong, that I needed him to be honest with me. He closed the laptop. He looked at me for a long moment, not the look of a man who was about to confess something painful and ask for forgiveness. It was a different look, measured, almost relieved. "Claire," he said, "I've been thinking about this for a while." My hands went cold. "I'm filing for divorce. I'm leaving. I'm in love with someone else." He said it the way you'd read a prepared statement. Then he added the part that I will never forget as long as I live. "You don't interest me anymore." I sat there in my own kitchen, in the house I'd co-signed the mortgage on with our dog at my feet, and I felt the floor disappear beneath me. Not because I hadn't suspected something was wrong, but because of the way he said it, like discarding something used up and no longer useful. I didn't cry, not right then. I just stared at him and thought, there is something else here, something he isn't saying. I was right. He moved out within a week, took his clothes, his laptop, a few boxes of things I didn't bother to inventory, left his key on the kitchen counter like a hotel checkout. The silence in the house was enormous. I moved through it in a kind of functional shock, teaching my classes, feeding Scout, answering emails. I held myself together with the discipline of routine, the way you clench your jaw against pain in a public place. I called my sister Karen the first night he was gone. She drove over from Evanston with wine and grocery store lasagna, and we sat at my kitchen table until 2 in the morning while I tried to explain what had happened. I couldn't make it coherent. The words kept breaking apart. "Do you know who she is?" Karen asked. "No," I said, and then, because I needed to say it out loud to make it real, "But I think he's been lying about more than that." I didn't know the extent of it yet. I would find out 9 days later. It began with a letter from Midwest Premier Lending, a company I had never heard of, addressed to me, not Daniel, a payment reminder, loan account number, principal balance, $350,000. I read it 3 times standing at the mailbox in the September heat, convinced I was misreading it. I went inside, sat at the table, smoothed the letter flat, and read it again. My name, my social security number, my signature, or something that claimed to be it, on a personal loan originated 7 months prior. 7 months. February. The same month Daniel had started leaving for work early. My hands were shaking. I opened my laptop and went directly to the credit bureau site and pulled my full credit report. There it was, the loan, the inquiry, the account, all of it. There were also 3 credit card accounts I had never opened, totaling an additional $47,000 in debt. All originated within the same 4-month window. $397,000 in debt, in my name, that I had never agreed to. I sat at that kitchen table for a very long time. There is a particular kind of fear that has nothing to do with physical danger. It's the fear of discovering that the structure of your life, the financial ground you walk on, has been quietly hollowed out beneath you. That while you were teaching Fitzgerald and growing tomatoes and trusting someone, that person was systematically dismantling your creditworthiness and your future. I was 41 years old. I had a teacher's salary. I had a mortgage. I now had nearly $400,000 in fraudulent debt attached to my name and credit history. I could have panicked. Part of me wanted to, but a quieter part, the part that had been watching Daniel for months, that had noticed things and filed them away, that part said, "Be very, very careful about what you do next." I didn't call Daniel. That was the first decision. Whatever I felt, the rage, the humiliation, the grief, I kept it inside. I understood instinctively that if he knew I had found the letter, he would move to protect himself. He'd had months of preparation. I had nothing yet. I needed documentation. I needed to understand exactly what had been done and how before I made a single visible move. Over the next 3 days, I gathered everything I could access. I printed the credit report. I photographed the letter. I went to my filing cabinet and pulled our joint tax returns, bank statements, the mortgage documents, everything I could find with both our names on it. I created a folder, physical and digital, and I labeled it simply evidence. Then I made one call, not to Daniel, not to Karen, to a woman named Patricia Ellison, a family law and financial fraud attorney whose name I found through the Illinois State Bar Referral Service. I'd specifically searched for someone who handled both divorce and fraud cases. Her assistant gave me an appointment for the following Wednesday. I spent the intervening days teaching. I graded papers. I walked Scout in the evenings along the same route we always took, past the same houses, under the same maples starting to turn. And all the while, in some back chamber of my mind, a plan was beginning to take shape. It wasn't revenge. Not exactly. It was something more deliberate than that. Daniel had made a calculation that I was manageable, predictable, and unlikely to fight back effectively. He had built his exit strategy around that assumption. I was going to dismantle that assumption piece by piece. Patricia Ellison's office was on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Chicago, overlooking the river. It was a Wednesday morning in late September, clear and cold, and I took the Metra in from Naperville because I didn't want Daniel's car, which was technically still in our shared name, anywhere near this meeting. I walked in carrying my folder. I sat across from a woman in her mid-50s with reading glasses on a chain and a deliberate, unhurried manner that immediately steadied me. I laid the documents on her desk one by one and explained what I'd found. She didn't interrupt. She made notes. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Merritt," she said, "what you're describing is identity fraud and financial fraud. If your husband used your personal information to obtain credit without your knowledge or consent, that is a federal crime. It also has significant implications for your divorce proceedings." Hearing it stated plainly, federal crime, made it more real and, strangely, more manageable. It had a name. It fit into a legal framework. It could be addressed. Patricia assigned a paralegal named Marcus to help me file fraud disputes with all 3 credit bureaus. We drafted letters to Midwest Premier Lending and to each of the credit card companies, formally notifying them that the accounts had been opened fraudulently. We filed a report with the Naperville Police Department, a necessary step to document the crime officially. And Patricia's office initiated contact with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division because the loan amount crossed the federal threshold. I also hired a forensic accountant named Dr. Sandra Webb, whom Patricia recommended, to trace where the $350,000 had actually gone. That last piece was where things became undeniable. Dr. Webb's preliminary report came back within 10 days. She'd subpoenaed the loan disbursement records and traced the funds through 3 accounts. The money had been transferred in structured amounts to an account held in the name of a woman named Vanessa Cole. Vanessa Cole, Dr. Webb noted, had a residential address in River North, a neighborhood in Chicago, and was listed as a co-owner on a recently purchased condominium. The purchase price of the condo, $312,000. He'd bought her an apartment with my name. I was sitting at my kitchen table when I read that report, and for a long moment I couldn't move. Outside, Scout was lying in the last of the afternoon sun on the back porch. The tomato plants I'd planted in May had gone brown and unpruned. Everything looked exactly the same as it had before, and nothing was. I thought about Vanessa Cole. I didn't know her. I had no image of her, no history with her. But I had her address, her name on a deed, and nearly $400,000 of fraudulent debt that she had directly benefited from. She was not a passive bystander. Meanwhile, Daniel had begun to sense that something was shifting. He called twice that week, once to ask about a piece of mail at the house, once under the pretext of discussing Scout. The calls were shorter than I expected, clipped. He was probing without wanting to appear to probe. I kept my answers neutral and brief. I gave him nothing. On Friday, I saw him drive slowly past the house in his car. He didn't stop. He just drove past, looking at the house. I watched from behind the curtain. He was beginning to understand that I was not behaving the way he'd expected me to behave. That was fine, let him wonder. Patricia called me Monday morning. "The police report has been officially filed," she told me. "We've issued a legal hold notice to Midwest Premier Lending, and we have enough documentation to proceed with the fraud complaint and the divorce simultaneously. Claire..." She paused. "He cannot dissolve this marriage cleanly, not with this attached to it." I wrote the date in my notebook, October 3rd. Point of no return. Patricia had counseled me to be patient. Legal processes move in their own time, indifferent to urgency. But in the third week of October, events accelerated, whether I was ready or not. The fraud complaints to the credit bureaus triggered automatic notifications to the lenders. Midwest Premier Lending, suddenly facing a federal fraud flag on a $350,000 account, froze the loan and initiated their own internal investigation. The credit card companies followed suit. This meant that the accounts and the legal liability attached to them were now officially in dispute, which also meant that anyone with financial interest in those accounts would be notified. Daniel found out on a Thursday. He called at 7:14 in the evening. I know the time because I'd made a habit of logging every contact from him. Date, time, duration, content. In a dedicated notebook Patricia had specifically recommended I keep. His voice was different. The measured, flat tone he'd used when he announced the divorce was gone. In its place was something tighter and more volatile. "What have you done?" he said. "I filed a fraud report," I said, "because fraud was committed." "You're going to destroy everything. Do you understand what you're doing?" I told him calmly that I understood exactly what I was doing and that he should contact Patricia Ellison's office if he wanted to discuss anything further. Then I ended the call and wrote it down. 2 days later, he appeared at the house. I saw his car pull up from the kitchen window and I called Patricia's office before I opened the door. Not to ask permission, but to log the contact in real time. He was on my porch for 4 minutes. He told me that what I was doing was vindictive, that I was making this worse for both of us, and that if I withdrew the fraud complaint, he would negotiate a fair settlement on the divorce. I asked him to leave my property. He left, but he looked at me on the way out with an expression I hadn't seen before. Not the dismissal from August. This was something rawer. The look of a man who had miscalculated and was starting to understand the consequences. Then came Vanessa. I had expected Daniel to be the central antagonist. I had not expected her to take an active role. But on a gray Tuesday morning, she called my cell phone, a number I never gave her, which meant Daniel had. Her voice was calm, which surprised me. Practiced calm, the kind that comes from preparation. She told me that I was creating a situation that was going to hurt everyone, and that if I was willing to be an adult about this, we could resolve things without the legal drama. She suggested we meet for coffee. I thought about the condo in River North, purchased with money borrowed fraudulently in my name. I thought about the 11 years of my life I'd invested in a man who had apparently been planning his exit while I tended our garden. "Miss Cole," I said, "I have nothing to discuss with you outside of a courtroom." She hung up. That evening, Patricia called to tell me that Daniel had hired a divorce attorney, a well-known and aggressive one, and that he was apparently preparing a counter-narrative, that the loan had been taken with my knowledge and that I had been an equal participant in the finances. It was predictable. It was also, given the forensic paper trail Dr. Webb had already established, not particularly credible. But it meant a fight, a real one. I won't pretend I wasn't afraid. I sat in my car in the school parking lot after that call, engine running, and allowed myself 10 minutes of pure, unguarded fear. I thought about the cost of the legal battle, about standing in front of a judge, about my name in documents and courtrooms and possibly in the news. Then I drove home, fed Scout, graded a set of essays on The Great Gatsby, and went to bed. I gave myself 4 days. I took a personal leave from school, drove to my parents' house in Michigan, sat by the lake, slept 9 hours a night, and let my mind rest. My mother made soup. My father didn't ask too many questions. By Sunday, the fear was still there. It never fully left. But it had been reabsorbed into resolve. I drove back to Naperville on Sunday evening. Patricia had 3 new updates waiting in my email. I opened them at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and read each one carefully. We were ready. November came in gray and steady, and with it a new tactic. Daniel's attorney sent a formal settlement proposal through Patricia's office. It was, on its face, almost generous. Daniel would assume responsibility for the mortgage in exchange for me releasing all claims related to the disputed loan accounts. He would give me 18 months of transitional support payments. The divorce would proceed as a standard irreconcilable differences filing, clean and quiet. The implicit offer was this: take the money, walk away, let it disappear. I read the proposal twice. Then I wrote 1 word in the margin of my copy in pencil: no. Patricia had told me from the beginning that this moment would come, that the other side would offer something designed to look like relief, because relief was the thing I was supposed to want. They're betting on your exhaustion, she said. They need you to be tired enough to take it. I was tired. I won't pretend otherwise. But exhaustion and surrender are not the same thing. I spent an evening with the settlement document spread across my kitchen table and worked through what accepting it would actually mean. The loan would be resolved. Yes, but Daniel's attorney had been careful not to include any admission of wrongdoing. Vanessa would keep the condo in River North. The fraudulent accounts would be handled through civil negotiation rather than criminal prosecution. Daniel would walk away from 11 years and $397,000 in fraud with a clean record and a new apartment paid for in someone else's name. There would be no accountability, not for him and not for her. I folded the proposal and set it aside. The antagonists pulled back after that. No more calls from Vanessa. Daniel went quiet. His attorney's office communicated exclusively through Patricia, formal and procedural. I imagined the 2 of them. Daniel in his new life somewhere in Chicago, Vanessa in her River North condo with its views and its fraudulently purchased furniture, watching to see what I would do, deciding how to adjust. Let them watch. What they didn't see was what was happening on my side. Patricia connected me with a financial recovery group, not a therapy group exactly, but a women's support network for survivors of financial fraud within marriage. It met on Thursday evenings at a community center in Oak Park. I went for the first time on a Thursday in early November, not sure what to expect, and sat in a circle of 7 women with coffee cups and careful faces, and heard things that sounded so precisely like my own experience that I had to concentrate on keeping my composure. Their names were Linda, Deb, Maria, Corinne, Susan, and Yolanda. Each of them had been through a version of what I was going through. A spouse who had leveraged shared trust for financial exploitation, and a legal system they'd had to learn to navigate without a map. They were at different stages. Some had finished. Some were still in the middle. Linda, who had settled her case 8 months earlier, leaned toward me after the meeting and said, "The thing that surprised me most was how much stronger I felt once I stopped waiting for him to feel bad about it. He wasn't going to, so I stopped needing him to." That sentence rearranged something in me. I went back the following Thursday, and the one after that. Karen came down from Evanston on a Saturday and spent the day at my house. We walked Scout along the river trail, and she listened without trying to fix anything. She told me she was proud of me in a way that was simple and direct, the way sisters can be when they decide to stop being careful. My students noticed nothing. I taught their eyes were watching God in my junior class and found, unexpectedly, that Hurston's prose steadied me the way good sentences always had. There is something about being inside a well-constructed paragraph that makes the chaos outside it feel temporarily manageable. December approached. The legal process moved forward on its tracks, and I was not tired enough to stop. They came on a Sunday in early December, 2 days before the first scheduled deposition. I hadn't invited them. The doorbell rang at 11 in the morning, and when I looked through the window, I saw Daniel standing on my porch, and behind him, slightly to the left, Vanessa Cole. I had never seen her in person. She was in her mid-30s, tall, well-dressed in a way that read as deliberate. A camel coat, dark boots, hair pulled back with the kind of effortless precision that takes considerable effort. She was standing with her hands folded in front of her, her expression arranged into something that was clearly meant to appear contrite. I studied her through the glass for a moment longer than was comfortable. This was the woman who had walked into a bank branch on Valentine's Day and signed my name to a $350,000 loan. I wanted to see her clearly. I opened the door but did not open the storm door. I looked at them through the glass. "Claire," Daniel said. He was using the voice from the early years, soft, reasonable, the one that had once meant he wanted to talk through a disagreement without fighting. "I think we've let this get out of hand. I'd like us to talk. Just talk. You brought her to my home," I said. "Vanessa wanted to come. She wanted you to see that this isn't about—" "Why is she here, Daniel?" There was a flicker of something, frustration, recalculation behind his eyes. Vanessa stepped forward slightly. "Mrs. Merritt," she said, "I know you have no reason to trust me, but this legal process is going to cost both of you. Financially, emotionally, it's going to be public. Your colleagues will see it. Your students' parents will see it." She paused, letting that settle. "We're not asking you to forgive anything. We're asking you to consider whether this is really how you want to spend the next 2 years of your life." I recognized it for what it was, not an apology, not remorse. It was a negotiation tactic dressed in soft language, a reminder that I was vulnerable too, that I had reputation and peace and time to lose. It was designed to make me feel the weight of what I was carrying and choose to put it down. And I'll admit, for one brief second standing in my own hallway on a cold December morning, I felt the pull of it, the idea of it just ending. The silence after a surrender. I understood, in that moment, why people take bad settlements. Not because they're weak, but because exhaustion is its own kind of gravity. I thought of Linda's words, "He's not going to feel bad about it, so stop needing him to." "You drove 40 minutes on a Sunday," I said, "because you're scared of what happens Tuesday." Neither of them said anything. "You're not here to make peace," I said. "You're here because you want me to save you from the consequences of what you did. And I'm not going to do that." Daniel's jaw tightened. The reasonable voice was gone. "You're going to regret this, Claire. When this is over and you've burned through everything fighting a battle you didn't need to fight—" "Get off my porch," I said, quietly, steadily. "Both of you." Vanessa's composure broke first. The arranged expression dissolved and something harder came through. Something tight and almost contemptuous, the real face beneath the camel coat and the folded hands. "You're being irrational," she said, and there was no softness in it now. "You're blowing up your own life to make a point." "Go," I said, and closed the inner door. I stood in my hallway and listened to them on the porch for a moment, their voices low and clipped. An argument between themselves, I thought, about what had just gone wrong and whose fault it was. Then I heard footsteps, then the car door, then the engine. I went to the window and watched them drive away. Daniel's car was moving too fast for the neighborhood, and then it was quiet again. I went to the kitchen and stood there for a moment and let myself feel it, a thin, bright wire of fear running along the inside of my chest. He was right that it would cost me. He was right that it would be public. He was right that it would consume the next months of my life in ways I couldn't fully anticipate. And she was right, too, in her calculating way that my colleagues and my students' parents and people who knew nothing about what had actually happened would form opinions based on fragments and headlines. But here was the thing he didn't understand. I had already lost the life I thought I had. The marriage, the trust, the financial stability, the future I thought I was building. He had taken those things before I ever filed a single document. The legal process wasn't costing me a good life. It was the price of recovering something real from the ruins of a false one. And you cannot threaten someone with the loss of something that's already gone. The fear was real, I felt it. And then I let it fuel me, the way good anger does when you know exactly what it's for. I called Patricia that evening and told her about the visit. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Good. It means they're nervous." Tuesday was 2 days away. The deposition was held on a Tuesday morning at Patricia's firm, in a conference room with a long table and gray winter light coming through the windows. The room smelled of fresh coffee and old carpet. A court reporter sat at one end, her fingers already over her keys. A small recording device sat in the center of the table, its red light steady. Daniel arrived with his attorney, a man named Robert Garrett, who had the broad, unhurried manner of someone who had won a lot of these and expected to win this one too. They sat across the table from Patricia and me. I'd worn a charcoal blazer I'd had for years. Professional, unremarkable, chosen deliberately. I wanted to look exactly like what I was, a public school teacher who had been defrauded by someone she trusted. I had slept well the night before, which surprised me. I had made coffee at 6, walked Scout around the block in the dark, and arrived at Patricia's office 20 minutes early. I was not the subject of the morning deposition. Daniel was. I sat beside Patricia and listened. It began straightforwardly. Garrett tried to establish the counter-narrative they'd been building for weeks, that the loan had been a joint financial decision, that I had been aware of and complicit in the borrowing, that the marriage had involved a pattern of shared financial risk-taking that I had retroactively chosen to characterize as fraud for leverage in the divorce proceedings. He spoke at length. He sounded confident. He was building a structure, and I watched him build it and said nothing and waited. Patricia let him build it. She asked foundational questions, patient and methodical, the way you let someone walk out onto a platform before you remove the supports. Then she opened the folder that Dr. Webb had prepared. She began with the loan origination date, February 14th, Valentine's Day. She asked Daniel to confirm that he had been present at Midwest Premier Lending's Chicago branch on that date. He confirmed it. She showed him the signature card. He confirmed the signature was his. She asked him to explain the process by which my signature, my forged signature, as the handwriting analyst report Patricia now introduced into the record would confirm, had appeared on the originating documents. Garrett objected. Patricia acknowledged it and rephrased. She set the handwriting analyst's report on the table and let it sit there. The court reporter's fingers moved steadily. No one in the room spoke for a moment. Daniel looked at the report. He said that we had discussed the loan, that I had been involved in the decision. He said this evenly, as though repetition made it credible. I watched his face as he said it, the practiced neutrality of it, the faint effort behind his eyes. And I thought, he has been rehearsing this for weeks, and it still isn't enough. Patricia then introduced a chronological record of my cell phone location data, legally obtained through our provider, requested months earlier. On February 14th, my phone had been at Jefferson Middle School from 7:43 in the morning until 4:22 in the afternoon. Not in Chicago, not at Midwest Premier Lending's branch. She asked Daniel how I had signed documents at a location I had demonstrably not been present at. He said perhaps I had signed them earlier. She introduced the loan officer's own internal notes, obtained through subpoena, which documented the signing as occurring in branch, in person, on the afternoon of February 14th. The loan officer had noted my hair color, my age, a description of what I was wearing. I am 5'4". I have brown hair. I was at school that day in slacks and a cardigan. Vanessa Cole is 5'6". She has dark hair. She had, it turned out, been in that branch on February 14th. Her own phone records, subpoenaed separately, confirmed it. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that is not thought but is the absence of any remaining option. Garrett leaned toward him and said something in a low voice. Daniel nodded once, mechanically, like a man who has forgotten why he's nodding. "Mr. Merritt," Patricia said with the same measured patience she had maintained for 3 hours, "who went to Midwest Premier Lending on February 14th to sign documents in Claire Merritt's name?" Garrett said, "Don't answer that," and Daniel didn't. But the room had already answered it. The court reporter's fingers had recorded every word. The documents were in the record. The red light on the recorder was still steady. There was nowhere left for the counter-narrative to go. By the afternoon, Vanessa's deposition had deteriorated into a series of Fifth Amendment invocations on the advice of the criminal defense attorney she'd quietly retained in the past 2 weeks, a detail that told its own story. Each question Patricia posed was met with the same careful non-answer, but non-answers in a deposition are not neutral. They are, in their own way, a form of testimony. At one point, when Patricia showed her the loan officer's physical description of the woman who had presented herself as Claire Merritt, Vanessa looked at the document for too long, 4 seconds, maybe 5, and said quietly, "I want to speak to my attorney." She was already speaking to her attorney. The slip lasted half a second, but it was in the transcript, in the record. Permanent? I sat in that room through both sessions and felt something settle in my chest that had not been settled since February. Not triumph. Something quieter and more solid than that. The truth was in the record now. Documented, witnessed, time-stamped. It couldn't be reframed or negotiated away. It existed independently of what Daniel believed or what Vanessa said or what Garrett argued. It simply was. Patricia touched my arm lightly on the way out and said, "That's the case." Outside, the city was cold and gray and entirely indifferent to what had happened in that conference room. I stood on the sidewalk, pulled my coat closed, and breathed the winter air, and let myself have 1 full minute of simply standing still. Then I walked to the metro station and went home. The criminal referral had been made to the U.S. Attorney's Office in November, and in the weeks following the deposition, the federal case moved with a speed that surprised even Patricia. The handwriting analysis, the loan officer's description, the phone location data, and Vanessa's deposition transcript, particularly the moment of her unguarded slip, combined to create what the assistant U.S. attorney assigned to the case described to Patricia as a structurally strong fraud file. Daniel's own testimony had placed him at the origination meeting and confirmed the signature as his doing, while simultaneously failing to offer any credible explanation for how I had signed documents at a location I hadn't been to. The cell phone records were, as the federal prosecutor later noted in pre-trial documents, essentially dispositive. There was no version of events in which Claire Merritt had been in that bank branch. The evidence didn't leave room for one. In January, Daniel Merritt was indicted on 2 federal counts: wire fraud and identity theft. Vanessa Cole was indicted as a co-conspirator on both counts. I was in my classroom grading papers when Patricia called with the news. I set my red pen down and looked out the window at the school courtyard. Bare trees, a few students cutting across the snow, the ordinary undisturbed texture of a Tuesday afternoon, and said very carefully, "Thank you." Patricia's voice was warm and businesslike in the way I had come to find genuinely comforting. "We're not finished yet," she said, "but the foundation is solid." The divorce proceedings, now running parallel to the criminal case, had shifted entirely. Garrett's counter-narrative had been eviscerated by the deposition record, and with federal indictments now public, his ability to argue that Claire had been a knowing participant in the loan had become legally untenable. Within 3 weeks of the indictments, Garrett withdrew from the case. He cited a scheduling conflict. No one believed it, and no one needed to. Daniel hired a second attorney. The new attorney's first substantive communication to Patricia was an inquiry about settlement terms. The inquiry was notably more humble in its framing than anything Garrett had ever sent. The settlement we reached in February, after 2 full days of negotiation at Patricia's office in the same conference room where the deposition had been held, with the same gray winter light coming through the windows, was by any measure a complete accounting. Daniel's equity in the Birchwood Lane house was transferred entirely to me. absorbing the remaining mortgage balance and leaving me with clear ownership of a property that was, by then, worth considerably more than what we'd paid for it. The fraudulent loan accounts, now formally tagged as identity fraud by all 3 credit bureaus, were removed from my credit report in full. Not negotiated down, not restructured, but removed, as though they had never existed, because legally, they never should have. Midwest Premier Lending and the credit card companies, facing federal liability for inadequate identity verification procedures, a vulnerability the FBI's investigation had exposed in sharp detail, reached their own civil settlements with Patricia's office. Those settlements covered a substantial portion of my legal fees and a portion of the documented financial harm. The River North condominium, purchased with my fraudulently borrowed money, furnished and lived in and presented on carefully curated social media as the beginning of a glamorous new life, was subject to a federal asset forfeiture order. The condo was liquidated at a government sale in March. The proceeds were applied to the criminal restitution order entered against Daniel and Vanessa jointly. Neither of them received $1 from it. At sentencing in April, Daniel received 28 months in federal prison and 3 years of supervised release, along with full restitution obligations. Vanessa received 18 months and was ordered to pay restitution jointly with Daniel. The judge, in her sentencing remarks, paused before delivering the sentence and described the crime in terms that I wrote down afterward from memory. A calculated betrayal of marital trust compounded by sustained and deliberate legal obstruction and the exploitation of another person's identity as a financial instrument. She said it without theatrics. She said it the way you state a fact. I was present at the sentencing. I sat in the gallery in my charcoal blazer, the same one I'd worn to the deposition, and I did not speak. There was a victim impact statement process available to me, and I had considered it carefully and decided against it. I didn't need Daniel or Vanessa to hear me say what had been done. The court record already said it, in precise legal language, permanently. That was enough. More than enough. I watched Daniel's face when the judge read the sentence. He had gone very still. The man who had sat across my kitchen table and told me I no longer interested him looked, in that moment, like someone who had run a very long distance and arrived somewhere he had not intended to be. Patricia walked out with me afterward onto the courthouse steps. It was April, and for the first time in months, the air smelled like spring. Soil and new grass and something opening up after a long time closed. "How do you feel?" she asked. I thought about it honestly for a moment. "Like myself," I said, and for the first time in over a year, that was completely, specifically, and permanently true. The house on Birchwood Lane became mine in a way it had never quite been before. I repainted the living room in the first weeks of spring, a warm, deep blue that I'd been thinking about for years, but Daniel had vetoed in favor of something more neutral. I remember standing in the paint aisle at the hardware store on a Saturday morning, holding the sample card and feeling the specific, uncomplicated pleasure of making a decision that was entirely my own. No negotiation, no compromise. I bought 2 gallons and painted it myself over a weekend, Scout supervising from the doorway. When it dried, I stood in the middle of the room in the afternoon light and felt something so simple and complete that I didn't have a word for it. I put a reading chair in the corner by the window and a better lamp beside it, and I spent a lot of evenings there with Scout at my feet and good books and tea I let get cold because I was too absorbed to drink it. I went back to the Thursday group in Oak Park through the spring, not because I needed them the way I had in November, but because Linda and Yolanda and the others had become something that mattered. A small, honest community built around shared experience rather than performance. I brought food sometimes. Yolanda taught me to make tamales. Linda and I started meeting for coffee on occasional Saturdays, talking not about cases or legal timelines, but about books, her daughter's college applications, what we were each cooking that week. These are the small things that constitute a life, and I had underestimated them for too long. In June, the school year ended, and I took a trip I had been putting off for 12 years, 2 weeks in Portugal, solo. Lisbon, the Alentejo, a few days in the Algarve. I ate dinner alone at sidewalk tables and felt no distress about it. In fact, something closer to luxury. The freedom of being accountable to no one's preferences but my own. I walked slowly. I sat in squares and watched pigeons and old men playing cards. I called Karen from a cobblestone square in Évora, a glass of wine in front of me, the evening light turning the limestone buildings gold, and she said I sounded like myself again. I said I thought that was probably right. She laughed, the way Karen laughs when she's relieved, and told me to bring her back something with a rooster on it. I brought her 4 things with roosters on them. I applied for a curriculum leadership position at the district level, something I'd been quietly qualified for years but had never pursued. Partly from inertia, partly from a marriage that had subtly discouraged me from expanding beyond what was convenient for someone else's life plan. I got it. I kept my senior English classes because I wasn't ready to give up Hurston and Fitzgerald and the particular pleasure of watching 17-year-olds encounter a sentence that genuinely matters to them. By fall, my credit score had recovered entirely. The fraudulent accounts were gone from my report, not disputed, gone, as though the architecture of the fraud had been cleanly dismantled. The house was mine outright. The mortgage refinanced in my name alone at a rate entirely manageable on my new salary. I was not wealthy, but I was stable. Really stable this time, built on something verified and earned rather than trusted on faith. As for Daniel and Vanessa, the trajectory of their post-indictment lives unfolded with an inevitability that would have felt too neat in a novel, but was simply what happens when federal criminal convictions attach to people's names in the permanent searchable reality of the digital age. Daniel reported to the Federal Correctional Institution in Yankton, South Dakota in May. His position had been terminated the week of the indictment. His LinkedIn disappeared shortly after, the professional network he'd built over 15 years. The clients, the colleagues, the carefully maintained image of a trustworthy regional manager dissolved with stunning speed. His name, when searched, returned court documents before anything else. That is a particular kind of consequence, lasting and structural, that no settlement could have produced. His parents sent me a letter in the spring. Short, clearly difficult to write. They said they were sorry, not in a lawyerly way, but in the way of people ashamed of someone they love. I believed them. I wrote back briefly and told them I didn't hold them responsible. I meant it. Vanessa Cole was released after serving 14 months. The River North condo had been liquidated before she surrendered. everything she'd built her new life around, erased by a federal forfeiture order. Her social media presence, once carefully curated with aestheticized interiors and travel content, went dark after the indictment and never returned. She moved, according to a mutual contact, somewhere in the Southwest. A new city, new anonymity, the slow work of rebuilding from considerably lower than where she'd started. I found I had very little feeling about this. Not satisfaction, not sympathy, just the mild awareness of a fact. What I had feeling about was the blue living room, the reading chair, Scout getting older and grayer around the muzzle, almost entirely white by October, still pulling toward the same spots on the river trail with the same unreasonable optimism. My junior class arguing about Janie Crawford with real, unperformed intensity. The student whose paper on their eyes were watching God was so perceptive, I read it twice and wrote her a note. Karen came for Thanksgiving. My parents drove down from Michigan. My mother with a pie she'd transported wrapped in dish towels in the back seat, which is what love actually looks like in practice. We ate at the big table in the dining room, repainted now in warm cream with rust-colored curtains that caught the candlelight. And it was ordinary and warm and specifically, completely mine. That was enough. It was, I had finally learned, more than enough. Looking back now, the lesson isn't about betrayal. It's about what you do the moment you find out. I could have panicked. I could have pleaded. I could have taken the settlement and called it survival. But I had learned, slowly at a kitchen table with a letter I read 3 times, that clarity is its own kind of power, and that the people who count on your silence are precisely the people who cannot survive your voice. Document everything. Trust carefully. Know your own name, because it belongs to you, and no one has the right to borrow it without permission. To everyone listening, what would you have done with that letter? I'd genuinely like to know. Leave it in the comments, your instinct, your choice, your story. And if this one stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for being here.